we're going to spend this $10 billion and say, okay, my kids and grandkids and their kids are going to have to pay, $300 million in interest payments from now till the end of time.
I understand there's some people who $250 will make a big difference for in that month, but there's a lot of people who are going to get that money. I would even argue most of those people where that's actually not going to make a tangible difference in their lives more than it would to actually invest it in solutions to the big problems in this province. Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're talking about how the Canadian and Ontario governments are trying to bribe voters with rebate checks and a GST holiday to stop what the finance minister called a vibecession, and why that framing makes me so mad.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Both the federal and Ontario governments have introduced a stimulus plan involving sales taxes. The plans have two components. The first one is what they call rebate checks. The federal government's giving $250 to everyone who worked in 2023 with individual incomes up to $150,000. And in Ontario, that's $200 to every single person in this province. The second part is exempting certain items from sales tax for 2 months, starting December 14th. This was a federal government initiative, but the province has committed to matching this. And there are so many questions we can ask about this, but I think the place to start is, why are they doing this?
Yeah, well, I'd say overall that the economy isn't that great for a lot of people. Prices went up a lot during the pandemic and haven't come down. Although we have inflation back to 2%, inflation just means that those prices are going up 2% a year. So the rate of that increase has slowed down, but prices are still going up. And there's a lot of people suffering out there that, food bank usage is, at near all-time highs. Folks are struggling. We had one of the worst summers for youth employment in about 30 years. So overall, I think there's at least some economic rationale for this. There's also got to be an obvious political component to this, that there will almost certainly be federal and provincial elections here in Ontario in 2025. Now, you have better instincts than I do about how voters think. Will these rebate checks and GST holidays, will they resonate with them?
I don't think they're going to change the outcome of the election at all. I think we know that Doug Ford is on his way to majority government, so I don't think that this is going to change that by any stretch at all. And the federal government, there's nothing that I've seen that suggests that this is going to stop the complete pummeling that the Liberal Party is expected to get in the election. I keep wondering whether people will even realize that it's happening, because I know that they are going to do the same thing that they do for the carbon rebate checks, where they just deposit it into your account. So I don't know if people will even notice that it's there, or a lot of people will. A lot of people might not. Normally, you'd see these kinds of stimulus packages when the economy is doing poorly, but like what you said is, yes, inflation's back down, and the federal government, I know that Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, she's arguing that the economy is doing fine, that our numbers are looking good across the board. And so what we're experiencing is a vibecession and not a real recession. So what did she mean by that?
Yeah, so overall, I think her point is that, the unemployment rate isn't outrageously high by historical circumstances. Yeah, there are some pockets of weakness like youth employment. That overall wages on average are higher than the rate of inflation, noting that that's just an average, so that obviously doesn't hold for everyone. That, our top line economic indicators, in her view, are looking all right. Not necessarily fantastic, but not disastrous either. But people aren't feeling it. People are very gloomy about their own circumstances, the economic situation in the country, their personal finances. And I guess what she's worried about is people are worried about the situation. They'll stop spending, and that will actually make the economy worse.
When you talk about wages and inflation, that wages have increased faster than inflation, over what time period are you talking about?
Yeah, just the last couple of years or so. Back when we had 8% inflation in early 2022, obviously inflation was rising faster than wages. But I would say since about middle of 2022, late 2022. But again, I think this can be really misleading as statistics. First of all, that everybody has a different growth in their wages, right? So it's just an average that way, and some people don't work at all. But we also experience different rates of inflation depending on the kinds of things that you buy versus I buy, and so on. So I think these averages can only tell you so much, and I feel like too many economists, particularly pundits, are overusing these metrics, and they don't really look at the fact that if you've got a mortgage or you rent, your rate of inflation is probably higher than average. Whereas if you're somebody who owns their home outright, doesn't have a mortgage, wasn't affected by the higher interest rates, your personal rate of inflation is probably quite low. Now, I know you weren't happy with this term vibecession. So walk us through it. Why was it so frustrating to you on social media and on Slack?
Yeah, it made me so angry when I heard it. Like, we talked about this exact issue in our episode after the US election, where politicians like to cite economic indicators as evidence that things are going great. And that ignores like the massive wealth inequality. And it ignores the fact that like a lot of people's costs have gone up so much and their wages really haven't gone up that much, especially if you look over like the last bunch of years while inflation was high. And I'm sure there are some people who are very comfortably housed, like you said, who are feeling like things are worse for them, but it's not actually worse. Like they are richer than they think. But for a lot of people, life is really hard right now. I know that housing is taking up most of their income. They can't find a new job. Unemployment rate is not particularly high, but I know and I hear it all the time about people looking for work at all levels, and they're trying to increase their income to make life easier, and it's just like impossible to find a job. It's such a terrible job market out there. And what seems to be happening is there's some people doing really well that are bringing up that average. And the government's really proud of that, that across the board, they can look at it and say, well, inflation's back down. Everything's doing great. Our GDP's not that bad right now. But especially if you're like a younger person starting out your career, like it's really tough out there and it's not just vibes. So I find it really offensive to hear academics and economists describe it as a perception issue instead of a real issue. It really feels like gaslighting everyone who has no pathway to affording a home, barely can afford rent. And maybe if they can afford rent, they're one personal use eviction away from not being able to afford rent or any other life circumstance that causes you to have to move. It's not just low and modest income workers, but even people making relatively high incomes are having a really hard time right now. And it's really frustrating when the government just seems totally tone deaf to that. When do you think that politicians will actually understand like the impact that the housing crisis is having on young Canadians beyond just like feeling bad?
Yeah, I really don't get this. I don't get the way that they're talking about the economy. I don't understand this over reliance on averages, both on the wages side, but again, particularly on the inflation side. Because yeah, if you're somebody with a pension that's indexed to inflation and you've paid off your house, you're doing quite well right now because that the value of that defined benefit pension has gone up and up and up, and your expenses like yeah, stuff is more expensive at the grocery store, and I don't want to downplay that because that is a real issue. But you haven't seen your rent get jacked up 10, 20, 30%. You haven't seen your mortgage roll over if you've got your house paid outright. So right now, I call it the kind of spectrum of terrible for the rest of us. That if you're a homeowner with a large mortgage and it rolls over, you get dinged. If you're a renter, maybe you're lucky and live someone under rent control, but it also means that you're kind of stuck in that house, right? Because the second you try and leave, go somewhere else, you're going to be paying much higher rents, or you're adult living with your parents because you can't afford to rent or own. So we've trapped a lot of people. And I find it really ironic that the same people who say that we shouldn't look at GDP per capita because it's just an average, it doesn't tell the whole story, will then rely on saying, well, wages went up faster than income, so everything's fine, when those are averages too. And they don't look at the distribution of wages, and they certainly don't look at the distribution of prices and distribution of inflation in the economy, because the rate of inflation I experience is different than the rate of inflation you experience, and it's a whole lot different than the rate of inflation that my parents experience.
I was thinking about when you're saying that about a little over a year ago, I was on a bargaining team trying to get higher wages. And I was watching how the people who had retired and had their defined benefit pension plan, like one of them showed me like the piece of paper that showed what they got for inflation, and they just like matched inflation, no problem. And most of them are people, they're retired. They typically got into the housing market early, obviously with exceptions. So I would see people who are like generally fairly comfortably housed getting an increase at the rate of inflation while we were fighting to get like half of the rate of inflation, even we were hoping for. Even that would have been nice, and didn't get that. And I think that it's there's something that seems so unfair about the people who are able to get it automatically who are retired. And I understand they worked hard, but then I also understand the people who were working really hard at this time with higher costs for housing, much higher cost of living, and not able to even keep up, just keep falling behind. And it's just so frustrating. And so many people said to me at the time, like, most people don't get the rate of inflation. So like, you should be fine without that. But it's like, when you're starting off your career, especially in a workplace with younger people, it's so difficult. And I don't think that's a unique experience that I had of it. I think a lot of people find that they have to move around a lot to increase their income. And that's not that easy to do these days. It just isn't. When we look at like some of the data on whether it's actually about vibes, like one of the things I'm thinking about is that kind of ability to move jobs. There's a tweet I want to pull up here from Steven Saretsky. Canada added 1.2 million people last year, but less than 95,000 jobs. And even if you use the more generous labor force survey, we added only 327,000 jobs. Vibecession confirmed, he said sarcastically. We'll put up the chart for people who want to see it who aren't watching in the video. We'll put it in the show notes. But I think it captures, like, it is very painful out there. It's not just a vibe. It's tough to get a job at all levels. It's clear from the numbers why that is. We could also look at Canada's food bank usage. We know that that's gone up. I've heard that in something like in the last 5 years, food bank usage has almost doubled. We know that homelessness is growing. So it's really not just a low income problem anymore. It's a lot of people who are who are working full time, who are really having a tough time. When you're looking at the data, like, is there anything that you want to bring up?
Yeah, I definitely look at those things. The food bank usage, which is actually way more than doubled in places like the GTA. Unfortunately, we don't have great counts on the number of people experiencing homelessness, but we see encampments all over the place in a way that we didn't 5 or 10 years ago. So, and this is why I think it's helpful to take a more holistic look at the data rather than, again, just saying, okay, I've got my one or two economic indicators that explain everything. And overall, again, I think there are some bright lights out there. Like, I don't want to suggest everything is awful. That a lot of people are doing particularly well. That inflation has come down. That the unemployment rate, while high, is not recession level. So it's not all doom and gloom, but there's enough negative indicators out there to suggest there is a real problem. So in that light, I actually think what governments are doing here to try and support people, at least in theory, you kind of see it. Go, okay, the economy's bad, at least for a lot of people. Let's try and do something about it. So let's start to dig into the policy details of what we're seeing from both the federal government and the province. So let's start with those rebate checks, or as you call them, these so-called rebate checks. And the Ontario plan is dead simple. Everybody, regardless of their age, regardless of their income, gets $200. That's, toddlers to people who are 100. Doesn't matter. Everybody gets $200. The federal one is way more complicated. It's $250, which obviously is $50 more, but it's only for people who earned labor market income, and that labor part is key last year. And their income has to be on a personal level less than $150,000. So if you divide out all of the people who didn't earn a labor market income, and that's that could be kids, seniors, persons with disabilities, have you, or people that earn more than 150,000, you carve all those out, you're only talking about half the population that gets the check. So they basically divided the population into two. Half of the population gets $250. The other half gets nothing. I know from our chats in Slack, you're not a fan of any of this. So again, can you walk us through why you don't like these plans?
I find these really frustrating because they're very clearly band aid solutions. The costs are massive. In Ontario, it's around $3 billion. dollars. And I can think of probably 3 billion ways that we could spend that money better than a one time check funded through debt. I think about how much $3 billion dollars could help in housing. If you just put that all towards building social housing, how much would that help? You think about healthcare, think about childcare, and I hear the province constantly crying broke, asking for more money from the federal government, saying, sorry, we can't expand childcare spaces, for example, or sorry, you don't have a family doctor, we can't pay them more, we can't get nurses more money to stay. I understand there's some people who $250 will make a big difference for in that month, but there's a lot of people who are going to get that money. I would even argue most of those people where that's actually not going to make a tangible difference in their lives more than it would to actually invest it in solutions to the big problems in this province. And then I think, is the federal or Ontario one worse? Like, on the one hand, the federal one only goes to workers, which excludes people on disability, students who couldn't find work because of a terrible job market. I'm not even sure if you were laid off and you were off for a year, or if you were on EI while you were on parental leave for a year. I don't think you get it. I'm not sure. Do you know, Mike?
Yeah, I don't think you would.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I know like a lot of the articles are focusing on how seniors are angry. Although we've discussed in a previous episode about how they also get a lot of debt funded benefits already through like old age security, which has a very high limit to when the clawbacks happen. We can link to that episode in the show notes so you can hear more about that. But I understand why they're angry too. Like, if there's just saying you go to people and saying, well, why aren't I getting this? This could help me too. Ontario's means that people paying to raise children get more, which you could argue is useful because, you know, obviously children are not working, thankfully, and hopefully we're not going to follow America and expand that to allow them to work at younger ages. But right now, that's not the case here. But it also means that there's no limit. And so I think even the wealthiest people, I think of like Galen Weston opening his $250 check and being like, thank you, taxpayers. But basically, both these plans are terrible because they solve nothing. They're not going to change elections, so they don't even understand why they're helpful to the government. I guess they'll make people feel good when they get them and then not actually do anything. You'll still like not be able to find a family doctor if we need one. So I guess the government's decided that's worth it. It's very annoying. What do you think?
Okay, so I don't hate the Ontario plan. I don't love it. I don't even like it. Maybe I'll give it a 5 out of 10, which is, I suppose, still a fail. But, I don't think it's that bad. First, people are hurting, so I think this will help. Yeah, it's an incredibly blunt instrument, but there are some positives to that. It's a little bit easier to administer. Yeah, I mean, could have they, let's say, chopped it, had an income limit of 150,000 and then, redistributed that money? Like, yeah, I suppose they could, but you're just talking about a few extra bucks, for the people earning 200. But I get from a moral point of view why why it offends people. I really don't like the federal plan. I'm going to give it a 2 out of 10, and that is very generous. I think it's terrible. It's just really poorly designed, where it creates a bunch of winners and losers, and who wins and who loses makes absolutely no sense, right? So you've got the couple who, earn close to $300,000, couple with no kids, they earn close to $300,000. They get two checks. But the single parent with three kids gets one check. The person on disability doesn't get any checks. The students who couldn't get a job this year because we had so many jobs that were taken up by temporary foreign workers and others, they were locked out of the market. They don't get a check. So it's like it distributes money to a lot of really well off people and leaves a lot of people who really need support in the dark. I think it's absolutely worse than a blunt instrument. So I don't know what the federal government's thinking here. I mean, I get why, again, like we said with the Ontario one, where you want to go, okay, let's try and funnel our resources to people who need it more. But they did such a poor job of that, creating these winners and losers. So I think this is a uh, terrible, terrible policy.
Either way, it's not a good idea to use this kind of money when we're in a country and a province that is like really has not enough money. We hear, especially in Ontario, the government talk about needing more money from the government. So to me, I'm just like, this is very irresponsible to use our money this way.
Yeah, I definitely think we should look at the fact that there's no revenue stream to offset this. And we're not, if it would be one thing if we're saying, okay, we're also at the same time going to increase taxes for the rich, or eliminate subsidies for some industry, and try and make this thing cash neutral. But you're right, it's absolutely not right. This is debt financed, and that's that's a real issue. But yeah, overall, the provincial one, I think it's a fail, but I at least see what they're trying to do here. There's some logic to it. The federal plan is just a disastrous fail. And speaking of disastrous fails, next there's exempting the GST on some goods for 2 months starting December 14th. I can tell you, not just as an economist, but somebody who ran a small business for over a decade and had to decide which goods and services were zero rated and not zero rated for sales tax. I absolutely loathe this initiative. It's terrible. I give it like minus 15,000 out of 10. The worst possible grade you could give, I give it like 2 grades lower. Like, retailers are going to have to adjust all their point of sale software here and go through item by item, figuring out which goods and services get the cut and which don't. And then they're just going to have to reverse the whole thing 2 months from now. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. This is probably the single worst idea, at least as far as taxation goes, I've seen from this federal government over the last 9 years. That's my take. I know it's a pretty bold one, but I'd love to get yours.
I didn't understand how difficult this was until I started seeing tweets from like Dan Kelly from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, who he said this: God help Canadian retailers trying to make heads or tails of the GST HST holiday. Check out this gem from the new CRA guidance. Exempt. Toys that either imitate another item, whether real or imaginary, or involve building, creating, or assembling structures, objects, or models by using pieces, parts, materials, or modeling compound. Not exempt. Toys and model sets that are marketed for adults. For example, adult Lego or train sets. Which I keep being like, well, that's like, first of all, very confusing when I think about what fits into there. I'm like, that sounds like almost everything. But then also, what is exempt? Okay, so if you have a kid who's like really good at Lego and you want to get them an advanced set, sorry, you don't get to do it. You got to make it easier for them. Or train sets. Like, I know a lot of kids love train sets. It's weird to say that that's not included. But then also, like, if you want to buy a video game console, that is included, which I know is very popular among kids, but like, I'm an adult and I play video games as well. So I know that a lot of adults who are benefiting from that too are like, woo, finally going to get myself this system. So it's really hard to divide that line between what's for kids, what's for adults. And then also, like, they point out things like most groceries won't have any GST or HST on it during that time. And I'm like, well, most groceries already don't. Like, prepackaged things do. And so I guess that's where it is. A lot of anything that's like considered like a junk food for sure has that on it. It'll be taken off. Alcohol sales, like, I guess that's great. Let's make it easier for people to drink more. Like, I guess we've made it clear in Ontario that's a priority for our province. Why not for the whole country? It just seems like not a good use of our money again. But on both the checks and the GST exemptions, you've referred to it on social media a few times as a massive transfer of wealth from the young to the old. Why do you see it that way?
Goes to the fact that this is debt finance. So, let's. I don't think we have a final estimate of what this is going to cost across the two orders of government. But let's suppose it's $10 billion, right? This is $10 billion that has to be debt financed, right? There's no offsetting revenue coming out. There's no other cuts or something like that. So this is $10 billion that we don't have. given to people who, exist today, who are shopping today, that's going to be paid for by future taxpayers. And that's not to suggest that those future taxpayers are, necessarily going to have to pay those 10 billion, but what they do have to pay is the interest costs on that 10 billion. So every year, let's suppose interest rates are about 3%. 3% of 10 billion is about $300 million. So taxpayers every year from now to the end of eternity, unless this debt ever gets paid off, are going to have to pay $300 million a year in interest payments on this debt. So basically what we're doing is we're pulling wealth forward from the future. We're going to spend this $10 billion and say, okay, my kids and grandkids and their kids are going to have to pay, $300 million in interest payments from now till the end of time. And it would be one thing if we were using this to build infrastructure, right? If we were building roads or hospitals or schools, I think that's a fairly fair thing to do, right? Because we could say, okay, yeah, we're going to build this infrastructure, but this is going to get used for 100 or 200 years. So that's fine that future generations are going to pay some of that bill. But this is gone. Like that, that beer you mentioned, that beer gets drunk, it's gone, right? And nothing gets left for future generations. So this is just one way, and we've seen many ways over the last decade, through high home prices, other debts left to future generations, that we're basically, just robbing the future to pay for the present. And I don't think that's right. And that's the one thing I really don't love about all of this, is the fact that is just juicing consumption today with no real thought on how we're going to finance this debt going forward.
I feel like you can sum up all of our complaints about this with that, what you just said, that like all of this, there's problems in implementation. There's things about it, like the way that the finance minister talked about it, the way economists talk about it, as it being a perception issue. Like those are all maddening. But the worst part of it is when you look at governments that are like, we care about generational fairness. We really think it's important how much this is going to cost us in the end, and how this is going to keep costing us because there's no plan to pay for it. So we're just going to keep financing the debt. So it just shows that both, the Liberals, and I guess supported by the NDP for part of it, and the PC in Ontario, none of them seem to care about the use of our tax dollars. None of them seem particularly fiscally responsible right now, at a time when we already are paying so much for the cost of living here. It's just so maddening.
Yeah, absolutely. So, ultimately what we've got to figure out how to do is build more things, right? Because that's where the gap is coming from, that we don't have enough homes and infrastructure and things like that, right? We're just focused on circulating money, across each other. That doesn't solve the underlying issues, right? All we're doing, particularly when we debt finance it, is trying to make our lives a little bit better today, by making future generations pay for our consumption.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about the GST holiday or bribe checks or intergenerational fairness, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.